you over the dead.
And then, well, but the one thing is, if anybody is watching on video, unless you don't want to be on the video, it won't.
Okay. Okay, so thanks for coming. This is the last in the series this year of the Hallways Talks. I know some of you have been attended the other ones that we've had, but the PA sponsored 3 talks this year. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I'm really just going to let us jump in and welcome Rachel Hennis and Blessing Chendu. And they're going to just give you a quick little overview of Hallways and their work, and then jump into our topic tonight, which you can see is raising an empathetic child. So thanks again for coming.
Thank you, Christine, for coming. All right. This is not good. Okay, let me know if you would like me to turn this on. What's that? Someone say yes? No, okay, not yet. So I'm Rachel Hennis. I am the director of the program at Hallways. We're going to just start out a little bit telling you who we are, why we're here, what our plan is for this evening. I want to thank Christine, as always, for organizing this and helping give us some time with you all, and hopefully some information and conversation that's meaningful to you as parents. So we are here tonight. We're going to tell you a little bit about our program overall. Some of you may have been at our previous talks this year, and you may be a little repetitive this first part. We'll just kind of ground the night in who we are and why we're here. And then we're going to talk a little bit about like the relational landscape. What are the different kinds of situations that may be going on with or around your children. And then we're going to really talk about what is empathy, right? It's a word we hear a lot. What is it really? Why is it important? What does it really mean for our kids? And then what can you do? We always try to make our talks hopefully really based in you having some strategies that you can take with you. And then we want to leave some time for Q&A. So ambitious, as always, but I think we'll get through it. And before we jump in, I did want to just get a sense, since we're a small, intimate group here, of what age your children are, so we can know that as we present. So if you don't mind, just like a show of hands of, is anyone here who has children in the lower school? Yeah? Okay. Middle? All right, and then upper. Okay, so we got a nice range of folks. Well, the good news is, as many of you I'm sure know, this applies from birth on. What are the things that we can do to help instill not just the value of empathy, but also actions around empathy. So to start, Hallways, we are part of the Freedom Institute, and the Freedom Institute has been around for about 40 years, located in Midtown Manhattan. Freedom Institute is an outpatient drug and alcohol treatment center, and Hallways came out of that organization. So when we started 30 years ago, we started working with schools where children had parents who were in treatment at Freedom Institute, and those were mostly independent schools. So we started doing counseling with with children that had 1 or 2 parents or caregivers in treatment with us. Over the years, we have expanded our programming a lot as drug and alcohol prevention research has shown us that what we really need to be talking about to prevent not only drug and alcohol use, but a host of other problematic, concerning behaviors is social emotional wellness. We need to be building skills. We need to be looking at what are different risk factors and protective factors for our young people. So that's what we do. We work with about 30 or so schools, mostly independent schools in the New York City area. And we do a lot of different things. We have this community-wide approach, which really means that we view our relationship and our services for those schools and with the schools as a partnership. So our services are kind of only as good as they land with you all. If they're meaningful to you, if they resonate with you, then hopefully you'll take some of the information and it'll help you in your parenting. So we really need to get to know the community in order to hopefully really target the information to be meaningful. So that's what we do. We tailor our programs to the specific needs, and this is kind of just a range of the programs. I do want to highlight, we're not going to kind of go through all of these, but what I do want to highlight for tonight are our assessments just off the bat, because we do these comprehensive social emotional wellness assessments for schools, and we do about, I don't know how many we've done this year, but we do, last year I think we did 34 of these assessments, mostly of middle school and upper school, meaning like 5th through 12th graders. 5th through 12th graders. And what we've done, what we find with these assessments, first they're based in a lot of research around, again, what are like the building blocks for healthy adolescence. How do you get there? Like how do you get to a place where you have a healthy adolescent? What are those building blocks? And we frame that, and the research literature frames that as what are the risk and protective factors, right? So what are the things that are going to increase the likelihood of unhealthy behaviors if they're present, and what are the things that will increase the likelihood of healthy behaviors, right? And one of the things that we find in the research literature is that empathy and the enacting of empathy is a critical protective factor for young people. The other thing that we find is that while there's a lot of value around empathy or talk of valuing it within the communities we work with, there's not so much enacting of it. So we see a disconnect in our assessments, in our work between those things. And that disconnect mirrors what we see in the research on affluent culture. So I want to ground us in that research because I think it's kind of critical for understanding any of these risk and protective factors, and we spend a lot of time at Hallways looking at this research, thinking through this research, seeing how it manifests in the classrooms that we are in. So what this research is around, and we can give you some good sources if you want to read more, because there's some really interesting articles out there, is that we see that young people in affluent settings, going to schools, yeah.
Could you just talk first about define affluent?
Yeah. I'm getting there. So what Christina's referring to is the distinction. Is what we mean is young people that are in settings where there's a lot of wealth, where there's a lot of competition, where there's a lot of focus on external markers of success. Many of the kids in those settings are going to the top colleges eventually. They have a lot of opportunities in that way. The risk factor, what you're seeing up here, is not directly necessarily related to coming from an affluent home. It's related to being part of the larger cultural context of affluence. So that's important to understand, right? It doesn't mean, oh, only rich kids are kind of exempt, right? That's not what we're saying, right? Or what the research is saying, or what we see. It's that young people in this cultural context, by 7th grade, start to diverge with their peers in non-affluent contexts around rates of anxiety, depression, substance use, acting out behaviors like petty theft or graffiti or cheating on exams. We see these rates start to diverge in 7th grade. In the research. The research has been done not in New York City, but in other communities throughout the country, affluent communities throughout the country. And one of the things that we see here of what the risk is that whether or not in individual homes, this is valued in the larger cultural context. What young people get the message that what is valued is these external markers of success, how well they do on the exams, how many baskets they score in the game, whatever it is, these extracurriculars, their resumes, that those are the things that are important as opposed to the intrinsic values, intrinsic markers of success, like who you are, what your quality of your relationship looks like, how you are connected or not to your community. These really stabilizing forces for not just young people, but all of us are kind of missing and vulnerable in these communities, right? So young people get the message that it's all about competing, it's all about getting into the top colleges, and Ivy or bust mentality, and even if in their individual homes or some teachers or some parents or some people or this group is saying that's not what we value, it's in the air that they breathe all over, but particularly in these communities. So we bring this to you when we bring it to our work because all of these assessments that we conduct and that we do, we see just these things, right? We see high anxiety, high stress, and one of the things we continue to see is low displays of empathy and compassion. So part of what the research shows why that is, right? It's not that kids in these communities have less compassion or less empathy, but that the larger environment is not prioritizing it, right? So this is, again, what grounds us. Each community we're in is going to have a different relationship to this research and to this work, but I don't think any of us that are in or working with the independent schools in New York City can fully kind of step away from this, right? I think we have to be mindful of it and how it plays out when we look at what are the qualities, what are the characteristics that we really want to be mindful of every day practicing with our young people, and like what are we up against, right? Whether these are our values or not. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Blessing to talk a little bit about the relational. Great, thank you.
Relational landscape. So before we jump into levels of aggression, I think it's really important to mention empathy because we as social workers attempt to take a strengths-based approach with all the work that we're doing, and I think to kind of understand that that's our ideal, that we get to a place of empathy where young people in the communities are understanding and having an intellectual value for empathy, but what we want is it to move beyond an intellectual understanding into something that people are able to live out and practice, right? So that's on one end of the spectrum, not pictured here. But we do want to take a moment to talk about what young people are facing as far as just their relational lives, and it starts really young, right? I formerly was a school social worker, and I'm admittedly somewhat desensitized to the language of bullying. I feel like it's a bit overused, and thought this was a really helpful tool. Just want to credit the Ophelia Project. They have a great way of sort of talking about the spectrum of behaviors and helping folks to understand the varying ways that young people may interact with one another, and also when to sort of be really concerned about some ongoing behavior. So I want to start out talking about something that's a bummer, right? So this is something that's not a great situation. It may not be a desirable situation to your young person, but it's not aggressive in nature, okay? So even if the child feels like a target, like in their mind, you know, they may say, you know, that person doesn't like me, they let me out, excuse me. The person who they think the perceived aggressor was not intentional in their actions. And so I think that's really important to highlight. So for example, you have a couple of kids, you know, who are siblings, and one of the siblings, say an older one, gets invited to a birthday party, right? And the other one doesn't get invited and is upset about that. That is something that would be more of a bummer because the perceived aggressor, like I said, wasn't trying to leave them out, it just happened. Then when we think about aggression, this is something that's more classified as like a isolated incident, maybe one time sort of thing where the intention is to be malicious, right? So I've seen this a lot on social media where young people will subtweet. So it's when you're going about, so whether that subtweeting will be on Twitter, but you know, any social media platform, when they start talking about someone but they don't name them directly. So I've had moments where, so for example, say it's, you know, we're playing on the soccer team and you're upset at the way this person plays and you lost the game. And so everyone knows it was Sarah who missed the, the key goal. And instead of talking about Sarah directly, they talk about the incident in an oblique way, where Sarah still knows it's about her, and lots of conflict arises. So that might be an incident of aggression if it's like a one-off thing. So when we're talking about bullying, though, this is getting to aggressive behaviors where it's purposely aggressive, it's unsolicited by the target, and then it's repeated over time. So that's the key thing to understand there, that there's usually an imbalance of power, and it's not a one-time thing, it's an ongoing practice. So the practice of people spreading rumors on Facebook, for example, right? And then, I know of Facebook pages that have been created to talk about groups of young people, like in a malicious way. So ongoing things like that, rumors being spread when you're in school and then out of school on social media are some examples of bullying behavior, because it's kind of ongoing in that way. And then I think violence, abuse, or extreme bullying, where it gets to a point where someone's feeling so targeted, ostracized, that they start thinking about harming themselves. It could be an incident of them being threatened physically. That's where it's extreme, and where we definitely want to take action. So these are just some things I wanted to clarify and highlight that I think are important to kind of have in mind as we continue the conversation today. So I kind of got into this a little bit in terms of some of the ways in which this can play out, but the social media piece, as many of you I'm sure are aware, adds a really complicating component to the relational landscape nowadays with young people. So the fact is that there have always been relational challenges, right? So when you were growing up, when I was growing up, conflict was there. It's part of our humanity. We might have been the person as a kid that was scared to be the last person picked in gym, right? Or maybe we get into a spat with friends and that changes our whole social dynamic. So I think it's really important to understand that there's nothing new under the sun as far as conflict. That still is happening. And we can all relate to that. But the difference is the way that social media plays itself out and sort of further exacerbates things. I was saying to a colleague today that that is the internet is amazing. The social media and the things that it has to offer is amazing, but the ways in which I've seen that be used as a tool in a negative way is really something that's given me pause in my professional work. But one thing that I think is really tricky about it is that the nature of it allows it to be more pervasive and ongoing, all right? So before, it might be, we got into an argument at school, I called you a name, I went home, it was over with. But the fact that you can leave school and still have things occur online is a piece that's really tricky and unique to social media. The other thing is that, it has this effect of sort of it being so public, that shaming effect, and the fact that there is an opportunity because it's preserved online for there to be continuation of bystanders just like watching and viewing this. And then another thing I think to mention that sort of part of the dynamic of social media is that it sort of makes it hard for you to engage with that empathy in the sense that the person is not in front of you, right? So I think prior to social media, the boldness you'd have to walk up to someone and just tell them what you really think of them, the fact that you don't see people's faces emboldens you, right? You're missing those sort of social cues that kind of let us know that someone's feeling hurt. The thing that sort of says hey, our empathy alarms aren't allowed to go off in the same way when we're not being able to witness folks. And so that's a really tricky piece, like I said, in terms of social media. But with that being said, I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind, particularly when you're talking with your young people about sort of this engagement piece, is that helping them remember that you dealt with some of the same things, even if the vehicle of social media wasn't there. Because we find in some of the research as well, is that the more that parents say, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine what it's like, this is so nuts that this is happening, it can sort of be distancing and make a young person feel oh, they don't really get what's going on with me. But undergirding all of the conflict that comes out and plays out online is relational challenges and conflict. And to be an adult is to have experienced all of these sort of things. And so I think just sort of helping your child see that connection is a way to sort of help them understand that even if the medium is changed, you still are well versed in being able to support them and through navigating through some of these really tough challenges. So focusing on those similarities, I think, is really a key piece. With that, we're going to go to how we can sort of play out empathy in action, which is what we really need to sort of prevent these behaviors.
Right, thank you. So yeah, so empathy is really like the antidote to all of that, right? Like the more we like promote and encourage and create communities that support displays of empathy, the less that we have those levels of aggression, right? They don't exist if we're actually engaging with each other and we're having our young people engage with each other in empathetic ways. So, you know, we want to talk about, like, so what is empathy? Like, really breaking this down and why it's important and why do we talk with so many schools about it and measure it and all of that, right? So we like this definition, which is actually out of the Making Caring Common project, which if you're not aware of, I would encourage you to sign up for their newsletters, and they have resources. It's through Harvard's Graduate School of Education. It's a really wonderful resource, and they have some parenting tips and practices that are, I think, really great. And we're going to give you these slides so you don't have to worry about notes or pictures or anything. You can, but you'll have the slides after as well. So how they define empathy is not just about, it's kind of two parts, right? So it is about being able to take someone's perspective and kind of imagine what it would be like to be in their shoes. And it's also then demonstrating valuing someone, right? So there is a piece of it that's about taking some kind of action to demonstrate that you value a person or you value their feelings, right? And so I think this is an interesting piece, an important piece, because, you know, they talk about this in the Making Caring Common project, that there's a lot of people, like they talk about, you know, salespeople and con artists can take another person's perspective in order to kind of get something from them, right? So being able to, you know, have a sense of how someone's feeling and kind of connect with that can be used for good or can be used to manipulate, right? So it's really not just about that ability. It's about doing that and then helping someone, demonstrating care, you know, furthering something good with someone. And so I think that, you know, it's an important piece, to think about, because what we're going to talk later on about how we promote empathy and what we actually can do on a regular basis. But, you know, when we look at low levels of empathy, right, or displays of empathy, like what we see in the research and in the communities we work in, it's also not about, you know, we're born with empathy, we all have empathy. It's about who, in what situations and for what people we demonstrate it and we feel connected, and like who is our empathy for, right? So often in these kinds of situations that Blessing just went through, we've othered someone, right, or a group of people. We've said, like, they aren't important, or they deserve this, or, you know, they're different from me. Whether we're actually able to kind of talk that through, or we're just showing that we feel that way, right? We are not viewing them as kind of their full humanity as connected to us as we might to, like, our little circle, right? And so I think that when we look at who gets bullied, when we look at who's a target, often, not all the time, but often it's someone that's kind of perceived as different or vulnerable, right? And so I think that when we're looking at empathy, it's really important that we're thinking of, like, who do our kids, depending on what age they're at, this is going to look different, who do they demonstrate empathy for, right? And we're going to talk later on about this directly kind of mirrors who do we demonstrate empathy for, right? When does our empathy kind of shut on and off, and what are the things that get in the way of it? And that's something else with our kids, is like, they have it, what are the things that get in the way? Is it, you know, we're anxious about, so they're anxious about like the social repercussions of you know, demonstrating empathy. They know that, you know, what actually matters right now, or they think what actually matters is that, like, I rush through this situation so I can study more because I have to get an A, or I have to, you know, show that I'm really great at this as opposed to stopping and connecting with someone. What is valued and what gets in the way, therefore, of demonstrating empathy? And that demonstration of empathy is what we call being an upstander, right? Which I'm sure is a term that's regularly used in your community, in many communities. It's a very in vogue term right now. We do a lot of consent educator training, and we talk a lot about upstander, you know, being an upstander. And it's very important. I'm glad that we're not talking about bystanders and we're talking about upstanders, because the research shows that it's a really effective thing, like being an upstander, stepping in some way, interrupting a situation. Most of the time, I think like there's some research, like 80% of the time in kind of bullying situations with young people, if someone steps in a situation, like they can interrupt the situation, right? So it's effective. But obviously it doesn't happen a lot. We have this thing which you're all, I'm sure, familiar with, the bystander effect, right? And that starts when you know, kind of taking that in, this idea that like someone else will deal with it, or it's not a big deal, you know, is something that kids start to learn from a very young age. They start to internalize that idea. Right, so when we're looking at what young people and children need in order to be raised with the values and the skills that they can then interrupt these situations that Blessing was outlining, right? It does start at this like community home level. What are the values in the community? How are they actually lived out? Not just what do we say is important to us, but how every day in the community are we stopping when there's a situation and talking about what we can do. And then the same thing, and we'll get into detail about what does that look like, creating an empathetic home environment, creating that climate at home, right? So it's really about, you know, the kids, what they really need is like us to really show them how important this is, to talk with them about specific scenarios, and to talk about what it means to be an upstander and what it doesn't mean, right? It doesn't necessarily mean you're like the hero that has to like come in and save the day. It could be as simple as like, are you okay? Checking in with someone when you see a situation happening, or distracting someone if you see a situation happening. It depends on their age, it depends on the situation. But often I think we have this idea that upstander means like you have to kind of come in, you know, and really have the, and fix it. And that's not how we understand it, and that's not what we're saying. We're saying that this is actually what empathy looks like when it's not just a value that we say we have, but we actually enact it. It looks like being an upstander. And it can be big and it can be small, but it's about putting that moment above all these other moments. And we're not going to do that if we aren't regularly, continually supported in making that decision to say, I'm going to not study more, I'm going to not rush over and do this, I'm going to not ignore this situation, I'm going to stop here and do something. Whether that's in the hallway, in the classroom, or on social media. So I think to like emphasize Blessing's point that, you know, it is that the more we can connect to like, oh, we don't know all the platforms. Like it's a losing battle to be like, I need to figure out the next app or the next, you know, social media platform and all the details of it, and that's what I need. Losing battle. The kids will always be one step ahead of us, and as they should be, right? That's kind of what it means to be a young person, is to be more in the know. And it doesn't matter in some ways, because that what really matters is, again, looking at like what are the relationship fallout and the human fallout things that arise on these platforms, and kind of connecting into that, what's going on. So observing and really being connected with that. So we're going to get into the last part here around kind of what can you do. And then we're going to leave like a good amount of time, since we're a small group, which is great, to kind of talk through all of this. I'm going to turn it back over to you for some strategies. So now,
I noticed our title there, Establishing Empathy in Your Home. And definitely, we're not coming from a place of assuming that that is not already a value that is being lived out in your homes, okay? But I think when Rachel and I were kind of talking and sort of building out the training, you know, it's like empathy, yeah, that's a good idea, right? Like, who's gonna be against empathy? But I think the reality is, in the busyness of life, and we're here in New York City, the intention that it takes to sort of be explicit about those values and sort of talk about what that looks like can be incredibly difficult. And so I think instead of establishing, it's really about furthering that practice and sort of having that top of mind in a way that can be difficult to do when you're sort of mired in daily living. So one of the things that is super important is that piece around being clear with your expectations and then also setting positive norms at home. And I think Rachel had mentioned this, it kind of alluded to this idea of, I think for most of us, it's easy to think about sort of loving and showing empathy to people that are closer to us. But I think this idea of expanding our circle of concern. So it's not just family members and loved ones, it's not just the people we choose to be friends with, but people in the world around us and the way that we show up is a really important thing to sort of be explicit about. Excuse me. This allows for focusing on being able to build a safe social climate in your home. And that's the way that your young person gets to move through the world, right? So they have that model at home for what a safe social climate looks like, and they can enact that out in their community and the world at large. So one helpful tool that we find in sort of establishing those family norms is this idea of establishing those and creating rules, and next slide we'll go through a tool for that. But one example of a positive norm that I think is sort of really helpful is like, for example, like if you're the Franklin family. In the Franklin family, we are leaders, right? So that's a positive norm, and then a rule is we stand up for what's right even when it's uncomfortable. And getting that granular so that, you know, young people start to understand, well, I'm a Franklin, so like what else am I supposed to do but sort of live this out through that repetition. So that's something that's really helpful. Then I think also observing your child and their peer interactions. And this is not to sort of encourage like being super invasive or spying necessarily by any means, but it's really about taking the time to observe how they're functioning with their peers. Because I think the reality is you know your child and children best. And so if there are ongoing things and relational dynamics happening, you're going to be one of the first people to notice a change in behavior, to notice some things that may be kind of subtle. And I think it's also important to highlight and name that while it may be difficult, or while as parents you may be more inclined to think of like wanting to protect your own child from sort of aggressive behavior in relationships, it's also important to consider and observe whether or not your child could be sort of practicing behaviors that need some tweaking and redirection as well. So it's, I think, helpful to get sort of a fuller sense. So whether it's like you're dropping them off at the extracurricular activities or noticing like if you pick them up at school and seeing how they're engaging and subtle things like that, I think it's really helpful to kind of get a temperature check of where things are at with them. And then in using the everyday situations at home, if you have more than one child, I'm sure, and even with one child, there's lots of opportunities for strife and stress and arguments to come up. And those are the opportunities to sort of say, you know what, maybe you made a mistake in that moment. Maybe I, as your parent, just snapped on you because I was upset and having a hard day. But I want to say that I apologize for that. And here's how I would have liked to have handled that differently. So it's a way of modeling that we're all human, we're gonna mess up, it's inevitable, but being able to show sort of, this is how we show up and practice empathy lived out. That's, talk about trial by fire, that's essentially what that is, empathy in practice using those everyday situations. So the thing that I think can be really helpful with that too is just like it gives young people an opportunity to sort of know that it's a safe space for them to be able to mess up and that this doesn't define who they are, right? So their actions may not have been the best in a moment, but they can recover from that. Then we want to take the time to challenge language and behavior that values others. So it can be anything from racial stereotypes or things like calling themselves or other people idiots, things that we often take for granted as no big deal. And I think one thing that I have found really helpful when challenging problematic behavior is moving away from language that's just limited to saying, that's not nice or that's disrespectful. And the reason being is that I found in working with young people, sometimes terms like that are a bit vague for them to understand what that means. They might have a sense that like, okay, maybe I shouldn't say this in front of this person, but aren't able to necessarily internalize a rationale as to why they should engage in that behavior. And the whole point of being able to have these conversations is that you're equipping your child with your values and a moral compass at this point, and being able to dialogue about the rationale of why we don't do certain things allows them to sort of take ownership of their own reasons and why this is important, so that when you're not with them, when they're out independent in the world, they're having their own sort of internal compass that's guiding them, that like started from you at home. So I think that's why that's really helpful. And also just that piece too that if we say things like, you know, that's not nice, it doesn't also drive home the point that you're trying to communicate about why it's important to value humanity in others and use language that demonstrates that value. And then in addition, we just want to avoid minimizing problematic behavior. I think it's easy sometimes, particularly around peer conflict, to say, you know, boys will be boys, or girls just love drama, right? So really gendered language around the way in which young people are engaging socially. And I think the reality is, even if the issues that they're facing, you know, as adults, just as we look on it, we're like, this is really not that big of a deal. The reality is, to them, it's their world and causes a lot of tension and strife and internal struggle. And so I think being able to, I mean, not saying that we want to go to an extreme, but that being able to sort of encourage your children to sort of have a higher standard about the way that they're engaging and practicing empathy with other people, and not sort of being quick to dismiss it as just their age or gender. So next, just want to highlight briefly the family norms contract that could be helpful. Just something where, whether you use this form or something akin to that, it's a great way to have a conversation with your family, children involved, about constructing what they believe the family norms should be and the family values. I think this is an excellent way, depending, and I think even from young ages, I think they're able to engage and be able to talk about what they want their family to look like, and talk about building buy-in. The idea that like, I get to be part of this, even if it's a 5-year-old, saying like, what are the things that make the family feel safe and comfortable, and let's talk about that. And so things, asking questions like, how do you want to be treated by other members of the family? Are there things that we do in this family that make you feel hurt or uncomfortable sometimes? Who supports this family? And then how would you like to feel when you're with your family? So once again, whether it's something that's written or just a space that you make for conversation, I think some of these questions could be used with a variety of ages, and I think it'd be amazing. You might be amazed at what might come out once you sort of have that sort of dialogue and sort of co-create together the sort of structure that you want in your home.
What do you mean by who, God bless you, what do you mean by who supports your family?
I think that could be something like, if we're part of a religious institution, or, oh, you remember that time where mom was really sick in the hospital, and, you know, friends brought over food and were there with phone calls. So I think it could be any number of things in that way, or maybe it's, because to me, even just in terms of support, well, I mean, mom and dad, you work, and, you know, like, you support our family financially. So I think it's open to broader interpretation.
Thank you.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Next, cultivating empathy. So going back to kind of what Rachel had mentioned before in regards to empathy and some of the challenges to empathy within the cultural context of affluence, we want to focus on who young people are versus what they do. We never want to sort of move away from encouraging students to be the best that they can be and have ambitious goals for themselves, but we think that it's important, and the research shows that it's important that that not be at all costs, right? So that there's a balance in sort of their ability to sort of internalize and talk about who they are developing as people beyond just what they produce. So that's where we find that balance in terms of achievement. And then we also find that academic performance does not suffer when parents ease up on pressure. In fact, their grades tend to be better when parents are lower on the achievement emphasis. The other thing too that's really important is just helping your children understand that their experience isn't universal. So once again, we're not saying, regardless of whether or not your individual family is experiencing, has a lot of wealth, I think it's helpful to help young people understand that whatever situation they're in, that their situation may not look like many other people's situation, and just understanding that there's a larger world out there, and that if they have benefits or privileges, understanding that, that's not something to be ashamed of, but also to understand that there's a world also that exists where people are living differently. And so being able to sort of hold both of those, there's another way of sort of increasing and cultivating empathy with young people. And then being able to take the time to discuss situations that may come up and strategies as well. So whether or not a problem has arisen, this is a great opportunity to take advantage of talking before. Like before they're right in the midst of things and it's like really pressured. So it might be situations like someone purposely excluding during recess or telling someone you don't want them to sit next to you at lunch. There are opportunities to talk about how to do things differently, right? So as you're observing your child and they're talking about either experiences that they're having, or you're asking them about, how's your relational life at school? Like, who are your friends? What's happening here? These are the times where they may share things that give you an opportunity to say, like, how can we have done that differently? And then listening first before attempting to problem solve, which can be tricky sometimes, because I think part of the role of being a parent is wanting to sort of do the best you can by your child and making sure that they're okay. It's hard to be a parent and see your child in pain and distress emotionally, right? But I think that piece around sort of listening first and kind of getting a sense of where they're at, and I think depending on age, I think at a pretty young age saying, how do you think that situation should be handled? It's a really great way to kind of get a sense of where they're at. It shows them that you trust their ability to sort of start to think about making good decisions. And then in addition, it gives you an insight into how they're thinking about things anyway, and then gives you an opportunity to course correct in terms of something that's more in line with what your values are as a family. So that's why that's fairly helpful. And I think it's a great time for them to feel seen and be understood, and just feel your confidence in them, in their decision making. And then lastly, promoting empathy in action. So role-playing scenarios where your child can demonstrate being an upstander. It's important to note that research shows that we want to avoid children being the aggressor in the role plays, right? Because sometimes it can tend to kind of glamorize that, and we don't really want them practicing how to be an aggressor. And I think even if role plays are not necessarily something you get excited about, it could be kind of awkward sometimes. Even if it's uncomfortable, it's a great opportunity to practice the skills. And honestly, to me, it's not about being amazing at acting. I mean, honestly, you can have a good time with it, but it's really about getting to the point where you're able to process and have the conversation with them after being able to practice it. Even if they're at an age where they just sort of roll their eyes and are like, this is really like not worth my time. I think being able to just be like, bear with me, take a couple minutes, whatever, we'll have a treat after, but just sort of like kind of getting that on their radar is really helpful. And then using media and books to illustrate what this looks like in practice. So if you're reading books with your child, if you're watching movies, if you don't, sometimes popping in for an episode of something is a great way to sort of like in vivo look at a situation and say, hey, what do you think about this? Do you feel like this character was empathetic? Why or why not? And then sort of hearing back what they have to say about it is a wonderful way to kind of get a check of their understanding, and also a really great way to sort of humanize how sometimes, even if we're looking at something or watching a show where someone's behaving terribly, being able to talk about, yeah, that character was really rough. What are some of the challenges to being our best selves sometimes? And being able to talk about how that's part of being human, is messing up. Then modeling empathy. You know, they watch what you do, and I think the piece about being human and being able to say, like, hey, I messed up. That's, parents mess up, and being able to sort of reiterate that with them is a really helpful way of practicing that empathy. And then asking specific questions. So the check-in piece, the standard, you know, once again, when you're busy, the how is your day, right? Nothing wrong with how is your day, but I think even just taking it a step further to say, like, you know, what's something that you're proud of that you did today? Or who were you able to help today? How did you strengthen your relationships with people today? These are things that I think are questions that sort of get them thinking in a different way about how to engage with people and sort of sensitize them to the fact of that's mom or dad's value. That's why they're asking about it. And over time, that's when they start to internalize that as their value. So that's all I have for us today. Here's our resources page, and would love to take any questions that you all may have. Yes?
Yeah. You seem to be saying at the start that, you know, being empathetic or more empathetic is a kind of a protective thing that's going to happen. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about that in terms of the research you've done, because what you said seemed to be more that, well, if everyone was